Dr. Malcolm Byrne. Thank you very much for coming and joining us here at UNC in Chapel Hill. You work at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. You're an expert on Iran and on Iranian-American relations. You've just published a book and worked on the nuclear deal of 2015 with Iran. What is your assessment? Is that deal a sensible way to proceed relations with Iran, or was it really something unwise which should not have been done?
I absolutely think it was a sensible thing to do. I think it's the best approach given the circumstances. I think it was entirely unrealistic to expect Iran to cave in to demands that it considered unworkable by the outside world. They did not respond to even the pressure of sanctions in ways that I think opponents of the deal may have believed. For example, they began this process with a small number of centrifuges, and in spite of years and years of sanctions, they steadily increased the number to over 19,000 now. So the sanctions may have brought them to the negotiating table, but that kind of pressure, much less the use of force, I don't think would have done what this deal has done.
Thank you. So you think the sanctions were effective to start the negotiations. Is that a general recipe for international relations, that imposing sanctions will in the end result to negotiations?
I think that's a very complicated question. There are examples on each side that might prove the case depending on what your point of view is. But I do think that they did contribute to bringing Iran to the table. I think another factor was Iran gaining acceptance of the notion that it could enrich uranium. Iran has always claimed that as its right under the NPT, but other countries interpret that treaty differently. But again, you know, being enough to bring you to the table is not the same as persuading you to do what the world community wants you to do. And that was the result of a lot of other factors.
Thank you. When we think of relations with Iran, what really immediately comes to mind is first the 1953 coup and also the 1979 hostage crisis. Have these legacies now overcome? Has that paled into the past? Has it become insignificant?
The group that I work with looks at those two events as the original sins of the relationship, that neither side has been able to overcome the emotions that are attached to them, and they have blocked progress on talks a number of times in the past. I don't think this deal does away with their significance, but I think the deal does show to audiences throughout both countries, if we're talking about the US and Iran, that there is room to discuss sensitive issues of great import to both sides without running into obstacles and derailing the process. And I think that's a very important concept for both sides to keep in mind.
Thank you. Iran, together with Russia, is supporting Assad in Syria. And that is not the policy of the United States or the other two Western allies, France and Britain, involved in the war there. So how was it possible to disagree with Iran profoundly in that question, but still come to a deal in complicated negotiations? What brought this deal about? What sort of pressure was imposed? What sort of skills were applied?
Well, that's a big question. I think there are plenty of examples in history of countries that are, at each other's throats in some ways, finding a way to the table to deal with arms control or issues of that sort. So this is the way that countries are supposed to operate. But it's been extremely difficult in the Iran-US case because of the emotions involved in these issues. So I think that what made it happen were a combination of circumstance, of shared visions of what was needed, and a lot of creativity on the part of the players themselves, the negotiators, and also very important the fact that the leaderships in both countries wanted this to happen. Now, the supreme leader is often thought of as being congenitally opposed to negotiating with the United States in any way, but clearly he has been behind this. As we now have evidence, he's been behind other or at least he's been okay with other attempts to negotiate in the past. So if you have the leaderships in line, then a lot can happen.
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of criticism about that. Not least, it is alleged that the existence, the very life of Israel has been put at risk by means of that deal. And of course, Israel, the Israeli government itself claims that, but also many other voices in the Western world. How would you evaluate that yourself?
I understand the reason for the concern. It's this is a hostile power in your neighborhood that may someday get this capability that could theoretically obliterate you as a state. You have to be worried about that kind of thing. But there is a tendency to make leaps in logic and to assume that because something could happen, it's likely to happen or even destined to happen. That's simply not the case. There are too many other factors at play in this instance to, in my mind anyway, to get in the way of the inevitability of that kind of outcome. I mean, it's not the same as a terrorist getting a hold of a dirty bomb, where the terrorist can disappear into a crowd and nobody will ever be the wiser. Any government, any state that is in a position that Iran may one day be, which I doubt, but may one day be, they're in an entirely different state, and the risks, the costs are far too great. These are not irrational people. These are people who want to promote their power, maintain their power, not obliterate themselves.
Thank you. You told us in your talk here at UNC that the Iranian people are actually quite pro-American, pro-Western. There's lots of sympathies, genuine sympathies for Western culture, let's put it that way. That cannot be said of the leadership. So is there an ever-widening gulf between the Iranian leadership, the clerics, and the general population, particularly, of course, the young in that population? So can we expect that there is another attempt at an Iranian Spring to topple the government, to really make it perhaps a more democratic society?
Well, that's certainly the concern of the leadership. I think they understand, at least as well as everybody else, that there is this widening gulf, and they are doing everything they can to prevent it. They are constantly talking about color revolutions, and they're concerned that the West is trying to impose this kind of thing on Iranian society. They have a phrase in Persian, the translation of which is West toxification. They are deeply concerned about being, poisoned by Western culture, and they do what they can to oppose it. But the demography is going against them, and this is going to be a big problem. Whether it results in a kind of a Persian Spring is another question. Everybody that I've talked to and everything that I read leads me to believe that Iranians really do not want a violent event, uprising or whatever. They've had enough of these instances. The 2009 uprisings were a bitter reminder of some of the previous events, and so I don't see that in Iran's future. But long term, this is a reasonable fear for the Iranian leadership.
Give us your own evaluation. Are you optimistic about the future of Iranian-American, Iranian-Western relations? I
am. Maybe I'm hopelessly optimistic, but it depends partly on how long term you're talking. I think in the short term, this deal really helps if it can work, and there are a lot of potential obstacles in the way, but if it can pan out for the next few years, that will strengthen the relationship. And I think in the long term, as I say, demographics are pulling very strongly in a certain direction, and unless something really bad happens that could be blamed on the U.S., I think that, and let me just sidetrack for a second, I remember very clearly when, for example, George W. Bush made the Axis of Evil speech. I got more emails from friends and acquaintances and even people I didn't know very well at all from Iran saying, what does this mean, and if this is any kind of an indication of where the United States is heading in its relations with us, then you should know that we will stand with our government before anything else. It was a remarkable signal from people who are pro-Western, very interested in integrating with the rest of the world, but showing very clearly that they are nationalists, and there are limits to what they will tolerate from in terms of outside pressure.
And your ultimate judgment, if I understand you correctly, would be that integration into the international community is much to be preferred than to attempt isolating and containing a government.
Absolutely. I can understand wanting to isolate governments under certain circumstances, but in a case like this, I think integration is easily the best solution.
Dr. Malcolm Byrne, thank you very much for your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.